Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what promises to be a very interesting conversation around an essential topic these days, which is how can the EU green policies support a just energy transition in MENA? And I emphasize here a just transition. So we'll be talking, of course, about how we transition away towards more renewables when it comes to energy, but how we do so in a way that incorporates concepts of justice, of including communities that have been historically marginalized, but also taking into account, like in any transition, there are likely losers and winners. My name is Nadim Houri. I'm the Executive Director of the Arab Reform Initiative, a regional think tank working on the Arab region and focused on issues of democratic governance, social justice, and environmental justice. And I'm very excited because we have a fantastic set of panelists whom I'll introduce in a second, but I want to first give the floor to Kristina Prinerova, who is a program manager at the European delegation and actually has been managing the program on civil society facility for the Mediterranean, under which this dialogue is taking place. Kristina, the floor is yours.
Hello, good afternoon to everyone. I'm Kristina Prinerova from the European Commission, from DG NEAR, the Directorate for Neighborhood and Enlargement Negotiations, and I'm responsible for the civil society projects at the regional unit and responsible for the civil society facility for the Mediterranean. This is an umbrella project financed by the Commission to allow for a structured dialogue with the civil society in the southern neighborhood. This dialogue started already in 2012, and we are already in the fourth phase of the facility. And this webinar is one of the activities that we organize. The goal is to put in touch the Commission and the civil society and other EU institutions as well, and enable them to exchange on various topics of the common interest. So today it will be the just transition and how the EU is actually contributing to it. And if you would like to receive more information about the program, please go have a look in our in the website of the project. But I'm looking forward to a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristina. And as moderator, I will actually try to keep my remarks to the minimum because we have a rich panel, and I'm going to have the difficult job of trying to get us having a real conversation in an hour and a half when I know we have a lot to say. So really, we're going to be examining two key objectives. One is, what are the pathways for a just transition in MENA? Emphasizing what would it take to ensure that the coming energy transition, which has started now in some cases for 2 decades in some of the countries, takes into account historical marginalization, socioeconomic impact, but also governance and including voices of impacted communities in the decision-making. And secondly, as Kristina mentioned, examining the role of the EU and having an honest conversation about how can the EU facilitate not just the energy transition, and we all know that the EU is today a key investor, player, but also client of this energy transition that is taking place across the Mediterranean, but how can it also facilitate inclusion of communities into the decision-making? Now, to answer these questions, we have, as I mentioned, a fantastic panel. And I'll introduce them briefly and then give them the floor. We'll start by actually hearing directly from the European Union and from Cyril de Valain, who is the team leader for connectivity, climate action, and environment at the European Commission's headquarters, DG NEAR, and who's had long, extensive experience of over 20 years on many issues related to climate action, environment, and dealing with energy issues, both in particular countries, but also at the regional level. And so Cyril, I'll be asking a few questions about what the EU sees as its key priorities on the energy transition, how it reconciles with competing issues of wanting to promote more renewable energy, but also Europe wanting to secure its own energy security, particularly after Russia's war on Ukraine? And what are the key instruments that the EU has been deploying? And do these instruments strengthen a just transition on these issues? And then we'll move the conversation to talk about really where some of the key decisions get made, which is around financing. And we're very lucky to be joined by Gabriel de Lastour, who is the regional head of energy at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And Gabriel has really been responsible for developing EBRD's power and renewable energy activity in the southern and eastern Mediterranean, and this including how to think about debt and equity investments. And obviously, when we talk about investments, there will obviously be talk about what sort of policy engagements with the governments of the region, but also the private sector. After this tour de table with Cyril and Gabriel, we'll actually jump more into a deeper examination of key countries. And we'll start with Morocco with Karim Choukri. Why we're starting with Morocco? Because really it is a leader in the energy transition in MENA. And perhaps its relationship with the EU has now become the most sophisticated, particularly when it comes to energy transition and particularly with the EU-Morocco Green Partnership. We'll explore with Karim a bit how Morocco has gone through its energy transition, what are the issues, tension points, and what has been the EU's role. And then we'll move slightly east from Morocco to discuss Tunisia with Mohammed Ismail Sabri. Mohammed is a well-established researcher and postdoctoral researcher at IISS at Erasmus University. And he's been working a lot on energy transition in Tunisia, but also the relationship of Europe in this energy transition. And finally, but not least, we'll be moving to talk about Lebanon with Lori Haitayan. Lebanon, a very different policy setting, but where really renewable energy has emerged as a necessity. And how can the EU help this transition in a context of very weak / inexistence governance? And to talk to us about it, Lori Haitayan, MENA Director at the Natural Resource Governance Institute, but also an expert on energy transition in Lebanon and across the region, and who actually has a fantastic new podcast called Energy Espresso, where she discusses a lot of these issues. So without further ado, I want to start the conversation with Cyril. And Cyril, maybe just to get you started with a couple of general questions around, what are the key EU priorities and policies when it comes to renewable energy in the Southern Mediterranean? Can you tell us a bit more about it? And also, what are some of the main instruments through which the EU is seeking to push for this energy transition?
Thanks a lot, Nadim. I hope you can hear me well. Looks fine. Thanks a lot. So good afternoon, Nadim. Good afternoon, everybody. Very happy to be here at this webinar. Thanks very much for inviting me. So in terms of priorities, you might have read that in 2021, the European Union has redefined its key priorities with the southern neighbor countries through a communication called the Renewed Partnership with the Southern Neighborhood. This was in February 2021, where we have specified for the numerous the different priorities that the European Union wanted to agree on with its partner countries. And in particular, on energy, we have highlighted 4 main elements. The first one being the massive deployment of renewable energy in the southern neighbor countries, with also the introduction for the first time of the need to deploy green hydrogen in the region, initially in the southern neighbor countries, but also possibly in the second step for potential export to the EU. There was a second priority set as increasing the interconnection between the southern neighbor countries And in the EU, in the framework of this long-term vision of having a better integrated Mediterranean area in terms of electricity interconnections. A third priority, not the least, which is boosting and mainstreaming energy efficiency in all key sectors of the economy, being it on industry, in the buildings, for appliances, in transport, and then also in terms of power production. And the fourth one was to increasingly fight against the fugitive methane emissions, which were also introduced for the first time into our energy priorities. So the political framework we are working on is the Union for the Mediterranean, that I guess everybody knows, which gathers 43 countries. And in this framework, we have signed 2 years ago, I mean, the UFM member states have signed a declaration on energy, which specifies some common objectives that the member states wanted to agree on. It is not a binding instrument, but it is an interesting, binding document, but it's an interesting document that you can find on the internet, which details in a way the four objectives that I have just mentioned in the document that was prepared by the European Union. So concretely, for each of the partner countries we're working with, this means increasingly supporting the greening of the energy mix of the partner countries in order to enhance their energy security, being less dependent from external actors. Increasingly also promote the stability of the energy supply, and also, which is very important, have energy which is affordable by the population, by the industry, and by each and every economic actor in the country. In terms of instruments, I think the first most important one is the dialogue we have with the partner countries. I mean, we nurture a very intense policy dialogue with each of the governments in the capital cities. This is done mainly by our delegation in each of the partner countries, but of course as well from here on in Brussels. I mean, we take part to this discussion. We try to identify what are, let's say, the challenges that the countries are facing, and to what extent we can support and accompany these countries in their energy developments. This is also done, of course, with in close cooperation with the EU member states. And we also talk very regularly with the international financial institutions. And I'm very happy to have today around this virtual table Gabriel de Lastour, with whom we talk very regularly from EBRD. We also talk more and more with the private sector, in particular through our delegation in the field. And we also seek to have, let's say, regular contact with the civil society organizations, being in the energy field, but also in the environment and climate domains. In terms of financial instruments, so I mean, we intervene through our traditional grants. I mean, I think you know more or less, I mean, what this grant aim at achieving for many decades now. I mean, we provide grants, for instance, to support reforms on the legislative frameworks. So we try to support capacity building, institutional building. We also provide grants, I mean, that aims at procuring some specific equipment, or to promote or to support some works, infrastructure work that are being necessary for the evolution of the reform in the different partner countries. But of course, we also have since 2007 our financial instrument, which we co-developed with the international financial institutions like EBRD, EIB, AFD, KfW, FMO, and so on, where in fact we provide a limited amount of money in what we call the blending approach. We mix it with some substantial loans from financial institution in order to leverage, let's say, the impact of the development project that we are supporting. So this is done through what we call this blending approach. And more recently, I imagine Gabriel will also have a talk about that, we have set up some guarantee mechanisms that are applicable in the southern neighborhood, where the EU money aims at, let's say, improving the business environment and de-risking, in fact, this business environment for let's say, the intervention of private operators, being it private promoters of project or commercial banks or any other private actor, that we bring in within our development framework this let's say the money and the funds which are available on the private sector side, which is a rather new approach. I mean, and we have tried to expand it in terms of objective, but in terms of volumes. It's in the making because I mean this instrument has been launched massively in 2021, and we are in the phase of, let's say, ramping up the availability of these guarantees at the regional level. My last point for this introduction is to insist on the fact that despite the very difficult situation in the southern neighborhood that we all know, we keep trying to promote a regional approach because we still believe that there is, let's say, a strong interest in working better together instead of having this kind of bilateral approach with other partner countries, which we do have, but overall also to foster this regional dynamics around the Mediterranean area. I'll stop here, Nadim, for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cyril, for this tour de table. And it's actually quite timely that you raised the issue of regional approach, because we all know the fragmentation, and there were recent announcements as well that maybe Tunisia, Algeria, and Libya are doing their own thing. Anyways, it's a highly fragmented environment, and how we think about that space is something I think we'll come back to. I wanted to ask you, for the second round of questions is one, and particularly because this part of the dialogue is to encourage exchange across the Mediterranean, that there has been parts of civil society that look at Europe's involvement and say, yes, Europe wants to promote green energy, but look, since Russia invaded Ukraine, suddenly see Europe a lot more interested in the good old oil and gas around the Mediterranean, massive investments. And so, yes, while Europe is investing a lot more in green energy, ultimately, these investments perhaps fail compared to interest in oil and gas in many countries. Now, and I just want to give you, the floor to kind of reflect on how the war on Ukraine has affected, to a certain extent, EU plans and strategies. Have they really? Is this just a momentary, kind of emergency response, or is the way Europe thinks about the energy transition, particularly in the southern neighborhood, changed dramatically? And maybe just so I don't interrupt you later, in addition, I just wanted to ask you, as a way of sort of concluding, as well as how has the EU integrated questions of a just transition in its plans and strategy? In terms, you mentioned the issue of trying to consult with civil society, private sector. Are there efforts to integrate communities, mostly those as well impacted by some of these projects? When we talk about participation of civil society, we know that we often overuse the term, but it's still very true, the shrinking civic space across the region. But there are also issues of good governance about who benefits, the private sector companies that are able to conduct these projects on the ground in some of the countries. So would love to hear from you a bit more about how the EU is integrating some of these issues in their programming, or if you're just acknowledging these are challenges and you're open to kind of exchange and think about how we can address them.
No, thanks a lot for these questions. As I said at the beginning, I mean, these priorities were set in 2021. So at the moment, nobody was expecting these dramatic events in Ukraine. So, I mean, the response that the EU has provided just after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was to identify, let's say, fast-track actions, fast-track impactful actions that would have, let's say, consequences and impact on the Russian economy, and in particular to get rid of the import of gas from Russia. I think we can all agree that, let's say, 2 years afterwards, this, let's say, this switch from supply from gas from Russia to other sources has, let's say, been overall successful. But I mean, within, let's say, this approach, then we as Europeans had to turn towards, let's say, other suppliers, and I would say naturally the ones which were closer to us in terms of geography were, let's say, solicited quite intensively by the EU. But we should not forget that the Green Deal is a project that which has as a kind of let's say horizon 2050. I mean, now we work on the long-term horizon. We have to live with the, let's say, the unexpected events that let's say hamper, let's say, the the plans that we had made a couple of years ago. So, I mean, we remain with the key objective to go into a decarbonized society by 2050, and also to accompany the partner countries who also want to take as objective, I mean, this Green Deal dimension, or to have it, let's say, maybe a bit less ambitious, but still to have this in their objectives and to have it translated into their NDCs. We have also taken into account in our partnership the impact of the war in Ukraine in our southern neighbor countries, not only in terms of in the sector of energy, but also in the sector of food. As we all know, we have tried to provide some fast support to I would say complex situation or crisis situation in some of the partner countries. We were not the only one, by the way, but I mean, this has been also a kind of attempt to react promptly to this unexpected event. And we keep, I mean, in our daily dialogue with the partner countries, this dimension of security of supply, not only on energy, but also on basic food. I mean, taking also into account the climate impact, the water scarcity elements. And this is also why we develop more and more, and we, in our, let's say, dialogue, this nexus approach. I mean, it's not new. I mean, we've done that for many years, but I mean, it's increasingly into our policy dialogue with the partner countries, and also in the cooperation actions we are defining. You mentioned good governance. I mean, this is at the core of our action. I mean, we really put at the center of any of our action the ESG criteria, environmental, social, and governance criteria, more and more. It's not only about letter or words. I mean, it's really about analyzing with the partner countries, with the project implementing partner, to what extent we can optimize, I mean, the impact of our action in terms of environmental, let's say, added value, and also the respect of some governance and social key criteria. Not easy. I mean, I mean, it depends on the situation, depends on the countries. But just to recall that this is really at the core of our approach with the certain neighbor countries. The question of just transition is also in our, let's say, daily work. It's also the case in Europe. I mean, the question of European energy just transition is an issue that we have in our countries. So, I mean, so we try to really tackle this issue as much as we can with the partner countries, try to see what are the actions, what are the, let's say, the reforms that the partner countries want to promote, so that I mean, the transition, this green transition is acceptable, is acceptable by each and everyone, and that each and every citizen can also contribute to it without having to, let's say, to suffer from it, if I may say so.
Great. Thank you very much, Cyril. And I'll come back to you after the round of speakers. And I missed, and I made an omission starting this webinar. For those of you, we have interpretation to Arabic and French. في ترجمة للعربي, il y a une interprétation en français. You just have to click on the interpretation. And the audience has an opportunity to ask questions. Just use the Q&A function on Zoom. After the first sort of going around the speakers, we will open and I'll be reading some of the questions. So please don't hesitate. I want to move, and Cyril, you sort of set me up for the next segment, discussing with Gabriel de la Tour on the role of EBRD. Obviously, EBRD very closely connected as European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to the EU's policy. And we've seen the EBRD prioritize generally green, low carbon and resilient economies as one of its objectives. In its own green economy transition plan, which is set to cover the period of 2021 to 2025, the EBRD is committed to increasing its financing to more than 50%, the financing of sort of green projects, green energy, to almost 50% of its annual business volume by 2025. So that's a very ambitious investment. And if anyone goes to the EBRD website, you'll see that their priorities include things like renewable energy, but they also mention just transition projects in this context. And the EBRD works in a number of MENA countries that matter to us today in the conversation: Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, Lebanon. So there's a lot to discuss, and we're very lucky to be joined by Gabriel, who I know will have to leave in about half an hour, but we'll try to benefit a maximum from his time with us. Gabriel, can you tell us a bit more about EBRD's projects and priorities in the Arab region, in some of these countries that I mentioned, and particularly when it comes to financing renewable energy? Can you tell us very concretely some of the projects that you've supported, and how have you managed, generally, to say the least, a challenging business environment, or one that's very uncertain and hostile? I mean, Cyril already mentioned one example, which is trying to EU providing guarantees and sort of to de-risk for the private sector. But can you tell us a bit about what's, the sort of projects, the sort of challenges, and how EBRD is thinking about a region that obviously has a huge potential for renewable, but there are also huge obstacles along the way?
Thank you very much, Nadim. Do you hear me well? Yes. Thank you very much for having me in this in the webinar today. First, I just want to concur with Cyril in saying that at EBRD we work very closely hand in hand with the European Commission, with our colleagues in Brussels, but also a lot with the delegations in each of the countries. So EBRD in the energy sector has several responsibilities or areas of focus. First of all, we are the core business is to finance renewable energy projects. We are the bank as a whole has a strategy to reach 50% of its investment in green investment in the coming years. But in the electricity sector, this is even stronger because, of course, the electricity sector is one of the main levers for climate adaptation, mitigation, and for the transition. So financing renewable energy projects is one of our key main focus. We are active in most of the countries in the region. In Egypt, for example, we were one of the 2 lead financiers for the large Benban 1.5 gigawatt solar project. We have financed about 12 renewable energy projects in Jordan, as another example. We are very active today in Tunisia. The solar projects under the concession regime are coming to financial close. There are new tenders, and we're very much involved in financing these projects. And in Morocco, we are also involved. We financed 2 wind farms so far, and so we're very much involved. So that's maybe the core business. But what we also do is we help the governments develop the regulatory framework. We help, and also the contractual arrangements. So we've noticed that one of the key constraints to development and deployment at scale of renewable energy is the regulatory framework, the contractual framework, mainly the power purchase agreement, which needs to be to the best international standards to be able to attract international investors in this area. And so we've been very active over the last 10 years and in basically in all the countries in the region, in Jordan and Egypt in over 2015, 2017, in Lebanon in 2018, 2019, in Tunisia 2019, 2021, in providing key support and also bringing in the perspective from a lender with the governments in each country to try to develop a framework which would be really viable for renewable energy. All this effort, of course, has been done with support from the European Union in different ways, and so of course it's the Team Europe spirit. I think is really important and has really delivered on this point. Now, a third aspect of our action at EBRD is to to look at the other investments which are required to make renewable energy happen. And there I'm talking about the grids. For every dollar you invest in a renewable energy project, you need to put 20 to 30 cents in the grids to make the renewable energy projects happen. The traditional electricity system in a country is you have a few big power plants, and so you have a few, high voltage power lines that bring the power from those big power plants to the consumer. With renewable energy, the paradigm has shifted. You have hundreds of plants all over the countries. You have an increase in demand with the electrification of the economy. So it's critical to think about the grids too, about the investment in grids. And those projects, those grid investments are usually developed by the national utility. And this is one other aspect of our action at EBRD, is supporting, providing loans to the public sector too. And this is where I would say the cooperation with our friends from the European Union is the strongest, because this is where we have a lot of synergies in our work. And finally, a fourth pillar, which is really starting to kick in these days, is the whole topic of decarbonization. And this is where, and so working with governments to really develop plans to, for the next 10, 20, 30 years, to achieve the decarbonization of the economy, of the energy sector. So currently we're working in Jordan on a low carbon strategy. We're starting to work in Tunisia on a low carbon strategy. And we are working very much in Morocco with the national utility ONE on a plan to also for the decarbonization, the transition away from the fossil fuel economy. So these are really the four big pillars. So maybe just to talk about just transition, I would say that the transition aspect, what we call at EBRD, the gender and economic inclusion dimension, is embedded in each of these initiatives. So it's really mainstream throughout everything we do. So, for example, when it comes to supporting the investment in the grid with the public sector utilities, we have programs for employment. We have programs to improve the HR policies. We have programs to develop partnerships between the utilities and universities to improve the youth inclusion of these projects. A second example is when we finance renewable energy projects, we have programs to look at the employment of the local communities which have been affected or benefited from the projects. So, of course, renewable energy projects are designed to involve big investments in the first year or so while there's construction. So that involves a lot of work, usually a lot of employment of local communities. But the whole question is, what do you do once the plant is completed? Because you need very few people to run a solar plant or a wind farm. And so this is the key question we as a development bank have been working on. And for example, in the big Benban solar project in Egypt near Aswan, we've been working on programs to develop entrepreneurship, to develop employment for the communities around the plant, which had benefited from a lot of work during construction, but were not needed anymore on the site. We've also been developing gender programs to improve the employment of women in the sector. So in green jobs, making sure that this new industry in the region has employs has a good gender balance in its employment. I have a lot of things to say, but I'm going to stop here.
Great, thank you. And I was going to move, but I know you might not be able to stay with us till the end. So I did want to just pose one question to you as a follow-up on this notion of just transition, and maybe share something we've heard from some of our partners in civil society in the region. The first is the concern that there's a strong push to invest in renewable energy for export in the region. And maybe we'll talk a bit later about examples. I mean, there was a big announcement about sort of the pipeline from Morocco that the UK is investing, but also Tunisia, at a time when these economies have not yet even, their energy mix hasn't yet, it's still very heavily dependent on very polluting coal or gas. But they need foreign currency, so the temptation to send their clean energy and export it to Europe is high. So this concern that green energy is just turning out to be another, fit for export industry that may reduce the carbon footprint of Europe, but will not help necessarily countries decarbonize their own footprint. Just wanted you to kind of give your thoughts about how does the EBRD engage with this? And secondly, EBRD for civil society, it's probably an organization that many of us don't engage with very regularly. So is there space for civil society to weigh in on projects, to give their feedback, not just on just transition as sort of employment fairness, employment consideration, but also on things like, we know some solar power plants are using, precious water resources that neighboring communities are being affected. So is there a more formal process for civil society to engage with EBRD?
Yes, so I'll take the questions one by one. First, on the export of power, I think the question I think we would agree with your statement that it should not be done at the expense of reducing the power supply to the local populations or the local businesses, and it should not be done at the expense of slowing down the energy transition in each countries. On the other hand, I think there is an opportunity because the North Africa, the Near East, which at EBRD we call Southeast Mediterranean region, is endowed with very, very good resources, solar resources, but also wind resources. If you look at the wind speeds in the Gulf of Suez region, in Egypt, in Jordan, even in Morocco, in the Akkar region, in the south of Morocco, these are very, very high wind speed, very good wind resources. Secondly, is the region also has a lot of land available, which is one of the problems European countries have today. And so I think there's a good case to say that for renewables in the region, they are particularly cheap and affordable. And so, of course, the number one priority has to be to decarbonize the local economies. But at EBRD, we are, looking at things in a very open mind, and we think that there is a case for export of power or export of derivatives such as green hydrogen, renewable hydrogen, or other type of resources. The energy, the low cost of energy has to. We want to, try to make the countries benefit from the low cost of energy that they get. On the other hand, as I said, there is a temptation, a political temptation, not to slow down the energy transitions. For example, announcing big targets for renewable energy, but delivering on them, but then allocating a part for export, which means that the difficult decisions to close down the fossil fuel plants are not made. And this is something we are also addressing through different programs. So in Egypt, for example, in the context of the COP27 organized in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, we launched with the government and our partners, the European Union and others, what we call the NWEFI, which is a country platform to see Egypt commit to closing 5 gigawatt of fossil fuel plants, aging plants, which had high emissions, and there was an envelope of support from a number of donors that could work on this. We really see these as not alternatives, but 2 different initiatives that have to be dealt in parallel. In terms of the environmental resources, the environmental impacts of renewable energy projects, this is also something which is critical for us. EBRD has had a long-standing engagement with the civil society on these topics, not only in the energy sector, but historically in other sectors like mining and oil and gas, which have huge impacts. I will tell you about a few successes, which is the work we've done in the Gulf of Suez to mitigate the impacts of birds of the wind farms in that area. There was a work that was worked closely with BirdLife International and at the time, and we set up this system on the shutdown on demand with radars, and developing a protocol with the army, with the investors, with experts, with the civil society to try to get a system which tried to mitigate to the bare minimum any impact of these wind farms on birds in the context of quite a busy bird migration corridor. So that's an example. But of course, we are open and we are keen to try to continue our engagements with civil society to further, continue to improve the way we work.
Great. Thank you very much, Gabriel. And I already see some people are starting to put comments in the Q&A. That's great. Please keep them coming. And actually, that's going to be a good segue to talk about, shifting gears and looking at some specific countries. And as I mentioned, we'll start with Morocco and with Karim Shukri. Morocco is really not only seen, but is in practice a leader in energy transition in the region, and has been a privileged partner of the EU on energy deals, including through the bilateral deal of the EU-Morocco Green Partnership, which was launched, I believe, in October 2022. And Morocco's king has announced ambitious plans, including that the share of renewable energy will be up to 52% by 2030. And we've seen a lot of projects. Many of us, when we think about renewable energy in Morocco, we tend to think about this massive solar power plants. Probably the most famous one is the Noor projects near Ouarzazate, which was actually captured in one of the James Bond movies. And in fact, the implementation of all these prominent solar wind projects has elevated the contribution of renewable energy in Morocco to about 20% of power generation, and that was even about 2 years ago. But, and unfortunately in our region, there always seems to be a but, and I'm just setting up the conversation now with Karim. The shift to renewables has also come at a time when we actually see Morocco investing in coal-producing electricity. And there were 3 new coal power plants in the 2010s, which represent about 40% today of power generation in the country. So, we see this contradiction. And I don't know if it's because of exporting some clean energy or just expanding needs. But 2, we started to see Morocco's civil society criticize some of the large-scale and government-driven projects as not sufficiently benefiting local communities. And actually, one of the first Q&As is an example of someone who's saying she lives 25 kilometers from a wind farm in Morocco, but is not sufficiently benefiting from this, and they have to get their energy from the traditional network. But we've also seen, I think, some communities mobilizing that some of these renewable projects, particularly these massive ones, have had a negative impact on their local communities, depriving them from access to lands that they have historically let their animals graze on, or even depleting some water resources. So I want to turn to Karim, who really has been very closely working on the energy transition in Morocco, to tell us what lessons can we learn from Morocco's experience in transitioning its energy mix so far. Maybe briefly, Karim, kind of the decision-making governance framework in Morocco, but really specifically, and I'm conscious of time as well, what space is available today for civil society, researchers, local communities to discuss and have an input into Morocco's plans on renewable energy? Karim, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Nadim. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here to speak on behalf of the Moroccan Institute of Policy Analysis. I'm an independent expert in charge of renewable energy policies and strategies. I have already worked in the Ministry of Energy Transition in the Moroccan-German Energy Partnership, where I applied, I deeply worked about the development of energy strategies from 2009 to today. When we talk about the energy sector of Morocco, of course, as all the participants already know, that Morocco energy sector depends heavily on important hydrocarbons. Currently, the country imports approximately 90% of its energy needs. The Morocco electricity production, we can just give some figures from 2022. From coal, we have 35% from coal, from hydroelectricity, 60%, oil, 7%, natural gas, 17%. Wind power is only 30%, and solar power is only 7%. Of course, here I am talking about the energy produced, not about the capacity. The government of Morocco seeks to increase security of supply by reducing dependence on energy imports, including increasing use of renewable energy for electricity production. As of the end of 2020, the share of renewable energy of electricity in the electricity capacity, it's around 38% with a capacity of 4 gigawatts from wind, solar, and hydro. Hence, Morocco was ranked, of course, among the top 5 of African countries in terms of renewable energy with this capacity, according to the last report published by ERINA, the International Renewable Energy Agency. In addition, the government of Morocco has, of course, expressed confidence that renewable energy sources will provide more than 52% by 2030. And I would like just to switch here to what you said regarding the development of coal. From my point of view, it's not a contradiction, because when we talk about coal here in Morocco, it's not a question of only to produce electricity, but it's firstly a question of the stability of the grid, and also it's a question of the cost, because when we talk about renewable energy, we should also make the link with the economic level of the country. If, of course, in some countries, it's acceptable that the kilowatt hour can be 2 dirhams per kilowatt hour or 3 dirhams per kilowatt hour for the large consumers, but in Morocco, it's not the case. We should keep the kilowatt hour by around 100 per kilowatt hour, which ensure the stability of the economy. Not only, I am not talking about any electricity here, but I am talking about the whole economy of the country. For that, taking into consideration the price of electricity is also an important issue. In addition to this question related to the price, also we should get lessons for what happens in Germany in last 2-3 years. The energy burden really it's a question today. For that, in Morocco, we can say that we are lucky because we are working continuously in a kind of a mix of our energy package. We are not focusing to develop only 100% of renewable energy because it's what we want, but the reality of the grid, the reality of the economy impose this question of to develop also other resources. On other hand, when we talk, of course, when we talk about the governance of the sector, the renewable energy projects are supported globally through the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy, MAZEN, as a kind of one-stop shop for private project developer, brings together permitting, land acquisition, finance aspects, as well as securing a state guarantee of the investment, which I think that personally that this is the key factor of the success of our energy transition, and also is the key success of the credibility of Morocco for regarding the financial institutes to mobilize this important use of budgets, because when we talk, especially when we talk about CSP, it's a project, it's a big capex. It's not easy to mobilize this kind of capex if the economy of the country, if the governance of the sector, it's not well developed and well organized. In addition to the projects developed by Mazen as a kind of state actors, we have also the independent power producer, the IPP, may also develop renewable energy projects. It's a kind of private to private projects under the law 1309 and sell the electricity to consumers or a consortium of consumers, even for very high voltage and the medium voltage. Also, I would like to underline that the Morocco government has prioritized the growth of renewable energy, of course, through the enhancement of the regulatory framework, because the regulatory framework is the first element to develop an energy strategy in a country. In this issue, the Ministry of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development has recently amended many laws related to renewable energy. I mentioned here the Law 3009 related to renewable energy, the Law 82/21 related to self-production, which gives today the right for Moroccan industries, Moroccan medium consumers to produce their own electricity and to consume it, and in addition to that, to inject the exceed of the energy to the grid, which will really open more the market of the energy transition in Morocco, and also will give the opportunity to develop more capacities. When we talk of course, to ensure the stability of the market in presence of a state producer with a private producer, private producer here, the Kingdom of Morocco has created the regulation agency, which ensure to the harmonization of the sector in terms of regulatory issues and also in terms of grid access. These amendments aim to improve, of course, the legislative and regulatory frameworks governing renewable energy projects by private sector while guaranteeing the security and viability of the national electricity system. Because, of course, it's a reality. We would like to develop renewable energies. We would like to privatize the sector to ensure the big intervention of the big share of capacity to be developed by the private sector. But on the other hand, we should also ensure the security, because the security it's a kind of we cannot discuss the security of energy access for a country. For that, the presence or the role of the state we cannot cancel it, but we can reduce it.
Thank you, Karim. Can I ask you a follow-up question on this? Because I think you highlighted two important elements. One, the issue of security and the role between the private sector and the role of the state to ensure, accessible energy and what is the energy mix. You also mentioned the issue of protecting the consumers and ensuring a certain level of pricing. But I wanted to, can you hear me? Sorry. It seems
yes, of course, yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about what about the local communities that have been in some ways impacted by these mega projects? Morocco has been a trailblazer in the region. And is that seen and is it taken now more seriously somehow that when these big projects are planned, the impact on these local communities has to be taken into account earlier on? Think about projects, programs, so that these communities don't feel these projects are not for us, they are for someone else. If you can briefly comment on this, I want to move to Tunisia afterwards, but because in a way, Morocco has now in the region the longest experience with some of these projects. Around Ouarzazate, we've conducted some interviews and via partners and via echoes of, some local communities feel, look, solar power plants use water. They need water to clean them, and this is depleting the little water we had in the region. Or now that there are no more jobs at the power plant, because as Gabriel was mentioning, you don't need that many people once the project is up and running. We're not benefiting, and we've actually lost access to this land for our animals to graze on. Is there more discussion of these issues? Very briefly, and then I want to move to Tunisia.
Okay, thank you. Globally, for this regarding the implication of local communities, Morocco provides the freedom to achieve personal and collective development by integrating participatory approach to advance education, health, and economic growth in all sectors. In Morocco, civil society can flourish. People can gather, plan, and act together for the development of their community and municipality, and higher trials by program, charters, and constitution, and must be committed to fulfill this for all sectors. But when we talk, of course, about the energy, these aspects aim to promote transparency, inclusivity, and participation in decision-making process. Firstly, by public consultation forums. The Moroccan government often organize public or consultation forum where stakeholders, including civil society organizations, researchers, and local communities can provide feedbacks on renewable energy policies. Also, we organize stakeholders workshop seminars. In addition to that, also we have a kind of partnership platform in the last 2-3 months. The Ministry of Energy Transition launched a platform to gather the feedback from civil society, from the public, the big public, from all Moroccans regarding the how to say a kind of evaluation of our energy strategies, and also the perspectives of what we should do in next 10-20 years, which means that the implication of civil society and the Moroccan people, it's very important. It's taken into consideration. When we talk about the big plans, we can take the example of more complex or middle complex. There are huge efforts that Morocco done, namely with Mazen and GIZ, regarding the enhance the social impact, the economic impact, not only on the national level but also in the local level, by developing the roads, by developing the education, by providing electricity access. Regarding the point about water, of course, yeah, today the water it's a huge problem in Morocco. It's not related to energy, to be honest. It's not related that because we have a power plant here in Ouarzazate that there are problems with water. No, this is not the case. But it's a kind of a global problem in the whole country that we should take into consideration. Of course, even the energy project should take that into consideration. For that, when we talk about middle today, middle will not use water for cleaning solar glasses, which means that from our experience in Ouarzazate, we are improving our experience in middle to reduce or even to eliminate the use of water regarding cleaning or other operation for these big plants. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karim. Thank you, Gabriel. Gabriel has to log off because he had another commitment that he had told us about. But thank you for joining us, Gabriel, for the first hour. I want to encourage everyone to keep these questions coming. And I want to move now further east from Morocco to Tunisia. So Tunisia has a slightly different story. It started out as one of the champions of the shift to renewable energy in the early 2000s. But then it stagnated. And by the end of 2021, the country only relied about 3 to 4% of its energy mix, I would say, came from renewable energy, way behind its initial targets. So we have a sort of a mixed story where, on the one hand, there is a huge potential, I would say, like the rest of North Africa, but there have been, in a way, tensions about the vision for the sector. There's a Tunisian solar plan, there's a lot of talk about it, but we see tensions on the one hand, perhaps between some of the unions, some of the national companies like STEG, but also challenges facing which private sector in Tunisia will be able to do this, and really some tensions, sometimes even erupting by mobilizations in certain areas like Tatawin, Tozeur, and others, where local communities actually mobilize against some of these renewable projects. To maybe talk to us about it, Mohammed, you're not only an expert on energy transition, but your field of expertise is really state-society relations. And you've looked closely at some of these issues in Tunisia, including some of the debates around whether Tunisia should go down the road of building up massive green hydrogen projects, often aimed for exports. Can you tell us a bit where we are at today in terms of the governance of the sector, the tensions, and if there is a clear plan, and where do you see Tunisia going?
Thanks a lot, Nadim, for the introduction, and I'm very pleased to be with you today. As you said, the Tunisian example is a very complex one with so many stakeholders and many issues to be considered. I mean, of course, we all hear about the opportunities that the green transition can offer for Tunisia. Just to state them quickly: energy inputs reduction, further energy coverage, diversification in energy mix, exporting to Europe, decarbonization, which will lead to more competitiveness for the sector given the CTEM, and that Tunisia is well connected to the European market. And also economic diversification and job creation, which is a bit in doubt, as I will explain later. As said, there was ambitious target set, like the plan to have 30-30, so 30% of electricity being produced by renewables by 2030, and then to be reached at 80% in 2050. There was schemes for green hydrogen to be produced and then exported to Europe through a pipeline that already transfer natural gas to Italy. So there were quite ambitious targets set. Yet one question: how about the framework in which this was to be conducted? What we are witnessing now is an approach towards green transition that focuses on the central role of the government, of the state, and less consideration for social actors, which is not something uncommon in the MENA region, unfortunately. And an alternative that would be more towards a just transition path would be something that would consider the interests of the different stakeholders and social actors, and look at their interests, and by this motivate them to join and support the transition. And I believe this would lead to more sustainability of such approach. And if we consider the different stakeholders, starting by the local community, when I spoke with the civil society organizations in Tunisia, you often hear many concerns on how the law regulating renewable energy projects made it voluntary rather than obligatory commitment, that these projects would benefit the people, about excessive use of water to generate green hydrogen in a water scarce country. And even if there are some commitment towards using desalinated seawater and not underground seawater, still there are concerns on the desalination process itself and the possibility that it might salinate the water surrounding and so affect the activities, fishing activities in the region. And also, if desalination is there, why doesn't it then benefit the people who are working on agriculture in the region? Why only should it be directed towards the production of green hydrogen and not considered as well the agricultural activities there? And as well, I hear concerns about the compensation is never enough. And it might be thought that, okay, in the Middle East, we have so much desert, you can just make as much as possible these renewable projects, you have plenty of desert. But actually in countries like Tunisia, and I believe also Morocco, these lands are part of the communal land for generations, and they should be enough compensated, and the projects themselves that are set there should be directed toward their benefit also. And also a concern, why don't they, the local communities, enter in the benefits of these projects as shareholders, for example, as communal, for example, collectives, and have a share of the profits of these projects. You often hear this. There are also concerns about the possible pollution, and there's an example of this with the Borj Salehi, which was a project done probably 2 decades before, and but it set a bad example, and that the people are concerned about. Generally speaking, you hear concerns on lack of transparency and lack of information provided to the public, and that the public are not really involved in the decision making. If you move to the labor interest, of course, the most heard voice would be the one of the General Federation of Electricity and Gas, which is a syndicate of stake workers, and it's part of the OGTT, which is the bigger labor union in Tunisia. And they have a considerable fear about the privatization of the energy sector. They would like to maintain public control over the sector, not only the transmission, but the whole process. And they always wonder, why should they be not involved in the process of renewable energy projects? Why should the calls for tenders and so on go to only for investors, and the state doesn't have, for example, a part of it? And I believe, I mean, whenever you hear the answer from the government, they always say the cost. We are concerned about the cost and having a lower tariff for the energy provided, but there could be negotiations and could be some involvement of the workers in this case. Less stressed are concerns on the training, and I also hear that in the field of renewable energy sector, technical schools and training centers are rather insufficient and needs to be accelerated. And if we are speaking about green jobs and the opportunity offered by the green transition, more care should be provided for this field. There is also the concern, the general concern in Tunisia on labor rights in the private sector and public-private partnerships, where labor unions are less active. And it's common to hear that unionization could be penalized by employers. And there is also the issue of the flexibility of contracts and even informality of contracts in some sectors. And all of these make it very hard for unions to support labor rights, and it creates a general atmosphere where private sector employment is less favored. And this explains why, for example, for many, any private involvement in the renewable sector, for example, would be negatively looked. If probably some changes to the labor law and more guarantees for labor rights in the private sector would be provided, then this fear about privatization of the energy sector could be a bit, I mean, minimized. Moving to the third stakeholder.
Mohammed, just very briefly, because we're running a bit out of time. So if you want to just conclude, if you have anything you want to add.
Yes, I mean, also business interest and backward integration, as said, that the renewable energy sector would generate lots of jobs in a short time, but what about the long term? And the long term, it means that we need backward integration. We need investment in industry that provide inputs for the industry. And I think that there isn't much investment, EU, FDI, and so on in this field that will generate actually many jobs. Also, green startups, also I mean, supporting innovation in this field. And so we need an approach that's more sustainable, that take care of these stakeholders' interest instead of focusing on the state, especially that I don't think that focusing on the state is sustainable given the economic crisis in Tunisia at the moment and so on, and that it is open political system still, comparatively, of course. And so we have to consider the stakeholders' interest. And thanks a lot for
thank you very much. And actually, the not focusing on the state is probably a good segue to talk about Lebanon with Lori. But also wanted to thank you. I think you raised, I want to just capture 3 points that you raised that I think are very important and we should capture. This idea that the land is somehow vacant and no one owns it, when we know that particularly in North Africa, there are a lot of communal lands, and that was one of the questions in the Q&A. And so the idea is, how do we think about this land? Who has a stake in this land, and how do we make sure that the local communities can profit? And why not include things like they share as part of the profit sharing, or they share in the benefits of these projects. I think too, Tunisia raises the issue of the role of labor, a country that still has an organized labor movement and genuine concerns, like we have seen in a number of countries in Eastern Europe, workers either in the traditional electricity sector fearing that either new investors will come and dislodge them. And finally, the point you mentioned, we didn't have much chance to talk about it, which is, okay, green energy, great, but what about the economic activities around it? And can you move upstream and downstream? And what sort of planning is required? So, I think a lot for us to chew on. Shifting to Lebanon and to Lori. Hi, Lori. So Lebanon, not much of, the state is absent. Renewable energy, the transition happened there, frankly, out of necessity. It's like renewable energy as a survival mechanism in some ways. But in many things connected to Lebanon, it's been chaotic. It's whoever can installs. For those of us listening to us there, it's mostly basically people installing their own solar panels, not because they wanted to get off the grid, but because the grid was not giving them anything to begin with. And really, in a way, the Lebanon example is, how can we scale up these individual initiatives? How can we ensure that these initiatives also take into account social justice concerns? So not only I have some capital, I have a nice rooftop, I can put a bunch of solar plants, but so what sort of governance? How do you scale up these individual initiatives? What is the role of institutions like EBRD in EU in helping scale up? Is there a role for municipalities as well there? Can they become bankable intermediary institutions? Let's start with this.
Thank you, Nadeem, for having me. And let's start with this. That's a lot already to start with. But just to put things into perspective, I guess, as you said, and starting with is it a just transition that is happening? As you said, it's out of necessity and not out of conviction. It's not that the people of Lebanon are convinced of the climate challenges and they're taking things into action and pushing the country to if you want to hit the targets that had been put by the government. It's just out of necessity and out of who has the potential, who has the capacities, they're doing it. And this push that we've seen and this increase from in 2019 or 2018, before the multiple crises that hit Lebanon, when we had only 100 megawatts of solar installment, and then pushing it now up to 1,000, and maybe it's going up, that is not because of the government and not because of government policies. As much as they want to say that it's because of them, it is not. And then this has been pushed by people, so by whoever can do that. So before that, there were some initiatives on a community level, in villages, that were supported by donors to put solar for electricity, for agriculture, for water, and then people came in to put it for their own needs. And then this is where we are now. We don't have this large scale projects, definitely because the government is not able to attract investment today. Even EBRD says it sometimes, they have money they've lost in the Lebanese banks on wind projects, basically, and they need that money back before they can even invest in new money in the government, supporting any big scale investment. So what you have currently is municipalities working with donor money. Basically, the EU has pledged to support small and medium enterprises for renewable projects. The same for US aid, had pledged $20 million last year or before to support, again, small and medium scale enterprises. So again, going to the private sector more than really working with the government, so that therefore you're talking about the potential could be for smaller scale project, decentralized, and de facto you're imposing the decentralization of energy. That's something that had been really fought by the government and fought by EDL, who had control over the generation of electricity and the distribution and the whole thing. So out of the despair, you might be going into something that could be a better option for Lebanon, that is decentralized small-scale projects in regions for people to be able to get the electricity need. So basically, that is like where we're going. So now, what's the role of donors like EU, USAID, EBRD, all of that? It's on the governance level, because you see, like when we talk about Tunisia, people are like kind of resisting private sector, and they're more like they want more involvement of the state. And in Lebanon, they don't care about the state. It exists or not. For years after years, they've been able to live without the state, with private sector and private initiative, but that's not good as well. So the two extremes that we have, where Tunisia wants everything to be revolved around the state, and Lebanon that wants nothing to be revolving around the state, you cannot function that way. There is a middle ground, and there needs to be an involvement of the government. When the government is involved currently, they come up with the decentralized renewable law, right? Excellent, bravo, everybody is clapping for it, EBRD supporting, other institutions supporting. You read the law, it doesn't push into anything. It's not applicable, because you're stuck with the implementation efforts. You need to have a regulatory body that is not there. They are saying that because of past grievances, the regulatory body is mentioned as de facto, that it needs to be established, which hasn't been established since 2002. So who says that it will be established now? And then they don't even mention someone else taking over, because they don't want to end up in the situation where they're giving power to the Ministry of Energy, because of, again, past grievance about like the monopoly that the Ministry of Energy has. So basically, what these institutions can push for, it's the good governance of the energy sector, which are like, quickly I will mention, and then if we have time we can go, because I know that we don't have a lot of time. So basically, a clear strategy for it, because you cannot tell me like 30% of the energy mix will be on renewables and that's your strategy and that's it, stop. And so a clear strategy, inclusive strategy, especially now that the situation has changed in the country. We're not like in 2018, everything has changed in the country, with a clear legal framework. Another important point is the need for clear responsibilities. Today, Nadim, who is in charge of this portfolio? LCEC says that, no, I'm just a consultancy, but everything goes through the LCEC. So we don't know who is the institution in charge of this portfolio. And that is very important if we want to scale up and really do it on national level. So therefore be more just than what is happening today. The need for institutions and for capacity building in the institutions that will carry on. Does EDL have the possibility today to work on this new energy system? I don't know. They can't even like function under the old system. So how are they going to work under these new institutional needs, capacity needs? The other point is, I guess, need for transparency. Look, I've been searching for data about like where we are now. من هالك لهالك, as we say. I forgot, like I've been away in Brussels, عم بنسى. But like we had suffered to find data somewhere, and that's important. We need the data. So transparency about the data is very important, and the need for accountability measures is important as well. Let me tell you something. A couple of years ago, and that will be my last point, a couple of years ago when the wind project was assigned finally, and there were 3 companies that were given the 3 licenses to work on the wind project in Akkar. And after that, 2 out of the 3 projects were bought by a person that is politically exposed in the country. And then there was a question mark about that. Today, the bank that was involved, the local bank that was involved in the wind project, is involved, accused of money laundering in Switzerland. These are like big, big red flags that we should really prevent. So when we're talking about scaling up projects, and then therefore, this is where the role of, as Cyril mentioned, like when the EU works, they make sure about ESGs, etc., etc. Same for EBRD, they do consultations, etc. Because even on that wind projects, they were really red flags about the consultations. They happened really, and even on the studies, the environmental studies, were they really done and were they accurate, or they were falsified because they were accusations of being falsified. So these are like very important elements that need to happen if we need to scale up the renewable projects in Lebanon and get to that just and fair transition.
Thank you, Laurie. I want to encourage people to send us questions. I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, just very briefly, because clearly the trajectory of Lebanon, it's not like suddenly we're going to start having a functioning state, and yet the needs are there. So for those of us who care about a just energy transition in Lebanon, for various reasons of equity, access, but also to stop the sort of control that private generator owners have and so forth. Two questions often come up. The issue of the grid, right? That if you're going to start, everyone tells you working on renewable energy, you need to have a smart grid. So if you have access, you can sell back. And you already mentioned that there are limits to what private initiative can do. Ultimately, you need a regulator, someone who sets prices, who ensures, who maybe, creates some sort of equilibrium in the system. Do you see anything in Lebanon? I mean, we've got Cyril here with us. If you were advising, and that'd be my first question to you, if you have a recommendation of, okay, we want to do this, we know all these problems, we know all the governance issues, we know the political exposure, we know. What would you do if you had a lot of capacity to reform things? Where would you put the energy so that these things can literally, like your own personal energy, to kind of scale up these renewable energy projects? Would you set up closed loops in local areas where local communities have a lot more stake in it? Do you try to work with municipalities, see if the EU can make them more bankable? Do you try to work with intermediate level institutions where you can find, maybe a public school with a hospital, with the local community, and you kind of create a closed network? I'm just curious if you have thoughts about how can we push a more just energy transition short of reforming our political system?
Yeah, so I like Cyril is not a stranger to Lebanon. I think he had served in the commission a while ago, so he knows everything. If I were to advise, like I would go and I think I'm pretty convinced by now. I would go on really decentralized projects off the grid. I'm sorry. So maybe some will say that could not, maybe it's not very efficient, but looking at the inefficiency of the system that we have in the country and looking at the prospect of like a very negative outlook of what could be done and reform and everything that needs, I would think that people deserve to be maintained in their cities, in their villages, and I think that the EU is very much that aspect of people staying in their countries and not leaving and going to definitely to the EU is very important to them. Donc stabilizing and making it for people like a really an environment where they can live and have a decent life. I think if it starts with energy, I would go for decentralized off-the-grid systems in regions and make it sure that people have ownership, because the more once you go decentralized and closer to people, people become more interested in holding people accountable. So that could bring like people being involved in how this generation, how they're producing electricity from green sources, how this electricity is being distributed. So you're giving ownership to people and to the municipalities with them to work together on these projects and to bring electricity to their regions and strive, and it will have like positive advantages like around the villages. I would do that, villages and big and cities and bigger cities. I would put my money in that.
Thank you, Lori. So if anyone has questions, now is the moment, right in the Q&A. I think the second one, Mawisa, we sort of addressed it as well. How do we ensure that these projects take into account that some of these lands are actually communal lands? And I think the broader question by Soha in the Q&A about the importance of equipping young generations with the studies. I think that's definitely a recommendation that one can carry forward to the EU and EBRD about specializations, skills, and making sure that this is available locally. I wanted to maybe go back to Cyril, if anyone has any questions, but to Cyril, if, in under a minute, from where you're sitting and your experience, would you have one key recommendation, and it could be from your experience working in other regions or something, that you think you can bring to the region in your role that would promote not just energy transition, but would promote a more just energy transition? Vague, you can pick the topic you want, but this idea, something that can be done not in 5-10 years time, but in the next 2 years, basically.
Thanks a lot, Nadim, for giving me back the floor, and thanks also to all the participants. I mean, the very, very enriching and fruitful discussion. I would maybe start from the last intervention from Lori, and to say that to me, in any country, when we see, let's say, a sound and efficient implementation of a sector strategy, being it energy, water, and so on, it is because it is calling for an action at each and every level. I mean, macro level, I mean, where we have strong, let's say, government and ministries that are able to define strategies, implementation plans, which are realistic, ambitious, which are well monitored. Then we, of course, have the meso level. I mean, where we have the mayors of the cities, we have the chambers of commerce, business association, of course, then the private sector, and then also up to the bottom, where we have the citizens themselves. If you talk about energy, being it in the sun neighborhood, but everywhere, I mean, you have to talk with the people to train them how to better manage their resources. There is a shortage in resources and energy. What is energy efficiency in a daily basis? Through training in schools, in companies, in associations, wherever you want. Then, of course, working with the mayors, I mean, because they have a very important role to play, as already said in the past hour and a half. And I mean, and you might know that in the past 15 years, we have worked a lot with the different municipalities in the region to try to enhance their understanding of what is the climate action at local level, what is the energy action at local level by drafting what we call the SECAPs, the Sustainable Energy and Climate Action Plans. Of course, working with the chambers of commerce, the business association, the private sector, and so on and so forth. And last but not least, of course, with the government, because at the end, they are the ones with whom we talk in priority, and they are the ones to set, let's say, for any country, let's say, the way of proceeding and the objective and the ambitions for each and every sector strategy. I was very happy that you mentioned, Lori, your advice, for instance, Lebanon, to work on decentralized approaches, because, for instance, when I was indeed based in Lebanon about 10 years ago, we developed a project called CIDRO, where, for instance, we implemented the first decentralized solar plant installation in Cabrija. Sorry for the word, la pronunciation. And we hope that at the moment, and by the way, we worked at that time with Electricité du Liban, who had given the agreement to test this new approach. I think this was implemented in 2017, but then unfortunately after that, I mean, I don't know where it stands today, but maybe it has stopped because of the events in your country. But what I want to say that we tried to work also in some new, let's say, demonstration approaches that had already been tested in other countries, so that it could show at the meso level that there could be some projects which were not that costly, but which would have a high impact for the population, where the population could, let's say, take part with, that they could come, they could see that it was working well, in order to, let's say, initiate some new dynamics that could then be supported and accompanied and promoted by the national level. And I think what you highlighted, Laurie, is also valid for other countries. I mean, and this is at least what we try to do, to maintain a very strong policy dialogue with the partner countries at government level, to, let's say, to accompany them. As I keep on saying, we don't impose anything. We are here to accompany, to provide some advice if necessary, to also see what is the, let's say, the best way of moving ahead in terms of partnership with the EU. But we also work on other levels with other actors, so that at the end, I mean, the initiatives that we promote are also at the benefit of the citizens. Not easy, because I mean, you also need resources, financial resources, but also human resources to develop projects at the different levels, in particular at the municipal level, also at citizens levels. But that's also where we count on local actors, civil society, associations, private sector, mayors, to also embark with us in this initiative, in this dynamics. And just to finish on the question I saw in the Q&A, I mean, a kind of quite straightforward criticism on, let's say, the energy transition, and the fear that indeed some neighbor countries would be seen at the end ultimately as energy reservoir for Europe. But thanks for this comment. To be very frank, I mean, this is exactly what we want to avoid. When we talk about partnership with certain neighbor countries, I mean, it's absolutely not this kind of, sorry for the word, post-colonialist approach, not at all. I mean, we are in a partnership. The partnership is equal footing. We talk, we want to talk, we want to move ahead at the same footing. I mean, there is no stronger and weaker. We propose, we listen, we discuss, we progress together. And if at some point on some specific elements there is, let's say, a disagreement, fair enough, fine. Then we move in a different manner. But I mean, the energy, I think, is particularly important, as well as food and water, because in the MENA region, I mean, we have no other choice. I mean, we are very dependent, in fact, in Europe, from, let's say, the natural resources that you have in the south. I think you are dependent, you could be dependent also from the EU on other, let's say, elements. And this is why, if we work together in a frank and a honest manner, like we try to do from the EU side, I think there are very interesting perspectives.
Thank you very much, Cyril. And anyways, we're trying to create these spaces for these honest conversations, and appreciate your feedback. I know time is wrapping, but if people can stay for another maximum 10 minutes, I promise we will be off by 10 minutes. If people can stay, I greatly appreciate it. It's on me. It was an ambitious agenda. Karim, very quickly, under 1 minute, if anyone has any questions, now is your moment, or any comment. But Karim, do you have any particular recommendation based on your vast experience, based on Morocco's long experience, in terms of saying, you know, we've done a lot to move on the energy front towards more renewables. I think Morocco should be doing this a bit better in the coming period to ensure it's more just. Something that Morocco could do in the next couple of years to involve maybe perhaps more local communities, and to ensure that people feel these projects, there's somehow, you know, this context that actually renewable energy can be a lot more democratic than the old form of energy that we used to imagine, and not replicate the same political economy of energy production that we saw when it was, you know, one big massive power plant and people are just customers. Any thoughts, recommendations in a minute or so?
Yes, I think there is a growing awareness in Morocco of the need to ensure that the energy transition benefits local communities and is accessible for all. There are several factors that should be taken into consideration. Firstly, the social equity concerns, inclusive policies and programs, community engagement, and participation. When we talk about community engagement, not only during the development of, during the realization of the project, but before, normally during the planification, during the development of strategies. For example, I give the example of Middles. Of course, today we start to realize the projects in Middles, but thinking about the project was 7 years ago, which means that the community should be taken into consideration during the first phases of the projects. Also, I think that the necessity, the importance of job creation, but in local level, also it's important. This is what we do here in Ouarzazate. There are a real engagement from Mazen to enhance and to enhance the share of jobs of local job opportunities. And finally, also, I think that ensure a kind of environmental justice is important. In other hand, I would also quickly to respond, just to have a comments regarding that there are questions regarding wind power, and maybe I can switch in French because the question is posed, is asked in French. À propos de la question, c'était sur les parcs éoliens. Bien sûr, lorsqu'on parle des parcs éoliens, ce sont des grands investissements et ce sont des grands projets qui débitent généralement, comme c'est mentionné au niveau des commentaires, sur tout ce qui était acheté. Donc, pour tout ce qui est local, on ne peut pas parler on peut pas parler que d'une électricité injectée directement sur au niveau de la communauté, mais ça n'empêche pas que la communauté elle est déjà connectée au réseau. Mais d'autre part, en plus de l'accès de l'électricité qui ne pose pas problème, il y a la question de la valeur ajoutée du projet. La valeur ajoutée du projet, généralement les parcs éoliens et surtout et aussi les centrales solaires sont réalisées dans des zones qui sont isolées, des zones qu'on peut dire qui sont moins développées. Mais avec l'arrivée de ces centrales, et bien sûr l'expérience de Warzazat, il justifie ça. Les communautés, eh bien les communes qui sont concernées, elles arrivent vraiment à bénéficier de plus en plus par le développement de ces projets, notamment pour tout ce qui est ouverture d'accès, soit les routes, soit les réseaux sanitaires, soit l'eau, soit l'électricité, mais aussi pour le développement de tout ce qui est école et aussi de l'intégration de la femme. Lorsque je parle de Warzazat ici, il y a des très bonnes expériences qui sont réalisées au Maroc en faveur de la femme, pour inclure la femme de la zone de Warzazat, la femme de la zone rurale, pour contribuer aussi, pour avoir un impact positif de ces projets. Donc cet aspect, c'est déjà pris en considération, mais bien sûr, on ne dit pas que c'est le parfait, on doit faire plus, on doit intégrer de plus la société civile, mais la question qui reste, il faut aussi mettre à jour, mettre à niveau la société civile pour qu'elle soit capable d'interagir avec la transition énergétique, parce que lorsqu'on parle de la transition énergétique, on ne parle pas d'un cas ce sont des questions très techniques, très technologiques, donc aussi la société civile doit être à la hauteur, au niveau de discuter, de débattre ces questions afin de jouer leur rôle positif dans ce sens. Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Karim. I think you're raising points, I think, that are also very important, that civil society engagement on what level, on governance, on the rights, but also perhaps a role of civil society to accompany local communities to be able to engage on the technical side of some of these projects. Hamad, same question to you on Tunisia, but also very, very briefly. Any key recommendation, particularly at this key moment in Tunisia, where we really feel the country is sort of torn, it's going to move forward, but it's not sure how. What do you think can be taken into account? Have you seen any interesting examples that can be implemented, any to ensure that Tunisia's perhaps coming energy, renewable sort of investments, excitement, is seen as more just and benefits local communities?
I mean, I know that there are projects for supporting green startups and like also sort of involving the civil society and so on. But I mean, whenever the GIZ for the European Union and so on, all of these projects needs to be scaled up, maybe, because it always mostly focus on a pilot example that should be emulated and so on. Maybe it should be more comprehensive. Also involving in the decision making, more involvement of civil society in decision making. And also considering this link between SMEs and multinationals in order to make sure, or maybe investment in sectors that would feed the sector, the renewable energy sector.
Thank you, Mohammed. And I'll just conclude. Lori, a question to you posed by Zaina Abla from Lebanon. This notion of decentralization, it works probably, it's easier to imagine in rural areas. There's lands, the communities are smaller, they know each other. But what about big cities, particularly a city like Beirut? You know, how does decentralization when it comes to energy work in such a context? Any thoughts on that? And you have a minute to resolve that big riddle.
No, look, it's not this or that. Basically, it's like you still have EDL, and you still have EDL that is providing electricity and working. So basically, the idea is like to get the pressure out of EDL, who's not able to produce enough for all the regions, and then all the other regions could find the way of dealing with electricity that is not centralized in the central government or in the central EDL utility. So EDL could be the one provider for the Beirut district, because as it has been said, there is no enough land, or there is not enough whatever it is. So EDL could be one provider for the city of Beirut, and you have all the private generators and providers of other electricity, and then they can compete, and in the competition there is better service as well. So it's not that like Beirut will stay without electricity and then all the regions will get this renewable. So, and then it is a mix between renewables and fossil fuel, mainly supposedly gas, because it's cleaner than other. Because for now, I don't think that there are countries that have been 100% relying only on renewables all the time, 24/7 for their electricity. And then when countries say that 50% of my energy mix will be renewables, what is the other 50%? When Lebanon says 30% of my electricity energy mix will be renewable, so what's the 70%? This is the 70%, the 60%, the 50% is where we are talking about. Don't use coal, don't use fossil heavy fuel oil like we use in Lebanon. Go maybe to gas, because gas, it's cleaner. And then the question is like, where do you get your gas? Is it imported gas, or is this gas that you are producing? And these are the issues that countries, governments, with civil society, with think tanks, with academic, with donors, with others, should be discussing in a country to have a clear agenda on energy transition. So it's not left to only governments to decide on that. It's not left to governments and donors to decide on that. And it's not left for the civil society or communities to have a veto power that could stop as well development. So it is very delicate to have an inclusive policy and strategy development for an efficient energy transition. And here then, that is internal stuff. And then when we sort our internal differences as communities and governments in the South, then we can start complaining about the global North. Because for me, it's like complaining only about the global North, that they need our energy and now they're coming and taking our energy, and us not having the right setup for our inclusive dialogue, etc. It's not fair. So me as a citizen, I need to hold first my government accountable, make sure that my government has the collective interest in mind and including me. And then if there is pressure from the global North, I as a citizen should be supporting my government, so not to abide by the conditions of the global North and care about me. So that's very important as well, about the active participation of the citizens from the global South, and stop always complaining about the global North. The global North is doing what is in their interest, and it's time for us to do what is the interest and the collective interest and the public good, and not the interest of the political elite, a small elite that has its own interest in mind and not caring about the collective.
Great. Thank you very much, Lori. I want to thank all the panelists and all the attendees. Sorry we went 15 minutes overboard, but I think it was a rich conversation. I think we could talk for a lot longer. I also want to thank the translators. I don't know, Christina, if you have any closing words. I think these spaces for dialogues are important. I think the idea we realize that the energy transition is not just technical, it is fundamentally about governance. It's also fundamental when we talk governance, it's about politics in the sense of who benefits, how do we, la chose publique as well, the public good, how do we define it? And this promise of renewable energy as somehow a more democratic source of energy is a promise that maybe technically is there, but for us to make it concrete, we need to find governance models that can work in our context. And I think we need to keep the conversations. Lori, you're right. We need to keep the conversations locally. We need to organize better. Civil society has to organize better. And we have to keep knocking at the door of important institutions. I think we heard Cyril and Gabriel. We will continue this engagement with you. Thank you for participating. Thank you for Christina as well for bringing us all together. And thank you to our entities for being patient and for engaging with us. Yalla. تصبحوا على غد أخضر. Hopefully tomorrow will be greener and more renewable. Thank you very much. And this concludes our session.